We generally view the shift from a passionate, idealistic youth to a cynical, grounded adult as a natural process of growing up. It is the accepted social script. You start with high hopes, and you end with a realistic perspective. This adjusted adult takes pride in being strictly materialistic and pragmatic. They view their current state as a hard-won victory over naive illusions. This cynicism serves as a form of psychological armor. By assuming the world is inherently degraded, the adult feels protected from disappointment and superior to those who still harbor strong moral or aesthetic passions. Psychologists Igor Caruso and Paul Diehl provide a starkly different diagnosis. They argue that this specific transition into cynical materialism represents a severe, degenerative, neurotic breakdown. From this perspective, the realist has experienced a collapse of their internal structural cohesion. They haven't matured, they have fragmented. To understand this, we need to map the exact neuropsychological mechanics of the ideal, how it functions as a structural axis for the human personality, and why its abandonment triggers a total system failure. Our societal model of adult realism is actually built on the wreckage of a collapsed mind. Depth psychology provides the baseline mechanics for this internal structure. Foundationally, the human psyche is a theater of constant friction. Our raw biological impulses pull against the rigid rules of the superego, tearing the personality apart. The ideal is a structural mediator that locks these opposing blocks into place, redirecting their destructive horizontal tension into a unified upward vector. This axis synthesizes intellectual, aesthetic, and moral demands. It satisfies a need for truth, a soul's need for beauty, and a conscience's need for justice, all through a single aim. This is the core mechanism of ego-altruism. It transmutes biological selfishness into a state where personal satisfaction comes from the welfare of others. Only this structure allows a person to endure hardship or self-restrictions without being paralyzed by fear. It provides the cohesion necessary to act against immediate biological or social pressure. Without this mediating axis, the personality lacks the tension required to remain upright. The mind becomes a scatter of sterile efforts, easily crushed by impulse or the demand for blind obedience. Paul Diehl's psychoanalytic framework details how this system begins to rot, beginning with a phase born of intellectual pride. He calls the first stage imaginative exaltation. It occurs when the individual stops working toward an ideal and instead begins to identify with the image of it. This is the Icarus phase. The individual falsely attributes the perfections of the ideal to themselves, mistaking potential for actuality. This produces the misunderstood youth syndrome. Because they have high aspirations, they feel inherently superior to their environment. They view the real world as a vile place that merely limits their greatness. The flaw is that they refuse to understand the world as it is. Because they don't understand it, they are entirely impotent to act within it, trapped in a vacuum of their own self-adoration. This isolation drives them towards echo chambers, groups of peers who validate their contempt for the outside world. This creates an atmosphere of shared delusion that masks their growing incapacity for real-world responsibility. This unearned elevation severs the psyche from reality. The individual becomes a fragile structure, completely unequipped for actual existence. To understand why this state inevitably breaks, we look to the neurobiology of environmental stress and the work of Ivan Pavlov. Inside the youth, tension builds between their arrogant self-image and real-world failure. As contradictions pile up, the brain faces a physical overload. Prolonged contradictory stress produces intolerable anguish. To protect itself, the brain triggers a sudden, involuntary mutation Pavlov called the ultra-paradoxical phase. In this state, the brain's responses flip. Positive behaviors become negative, and previous beliefs are discarded almost instantly. This is a physiological survival mechanism designed to relieve neurological pressure by abandoning the habits and convictions that caused the stress. To save the ego from the unbearable humiliation of being wrong, the mind executes a snap,
It drops the ideal entirely to align with the world it previously despised. Paul Diel calls this final stage banalization. The individual crashes into a state of amoral materialism. They now admit their previous failures, but they defend them as signs of adult realism, viewing their former sensitivity as a pathology to be mocked. This snap is severe enough to rewrite memory. Like Orwellian doublethink, the banalized person will deny obvious facts they witnessed to protect a new, flattened worldview. Psychologists Ribot and Chalet provide the evidence for why this is a degenerative state. They describe a law of dissolution that governs the breakdown of the human personality. In this process, the higher, more complex functions disappear first. The altruistic and ideal tendencies vanish, leaving behind only the most primitive biological mechanics: anger, fear, and immediate self-preservation. This regression directly mirrors the cognitive profile seen in senile degeneration. The cynical corporate adult is phase 2 of the same neurological disease that produced the exalted youth in phase 1. They represent the final surrender of the personality's complex higher functions. Modern societies leverage this biological vulnerability. By controlling the conditions of stress and reward, a totalizing social structure can manufacture a compliant population. These systems stimulate imaginative exaltation by offering pre-packaged false ideals through political movements or pseudo-mystical groups. They give the youth an unearned sense of superiority. The trap is then sprung through environmental stress. By overloading these individuals with social and economic pressure, the system engineers the conditions for the Pavlovian snap, breaking their resistance. Carvalho cites the example of a wealthy banker's son who rejects his family's materialism to seek spiritual depth in a sect. He enters the exaltation phase, feeling superior to his mundane parents. After the inevitable psychological snap, the system reintegrates him. He becomes a commercial cleaner for the very same sect's corporate holdings. He has been broken down to a lower, cynical state, but remains profitable to the machine. This is the macro-scale recycling of human ambition. Society first perverts the ideal, then breaks it, eventually harvesting the remaining biological energy for its own primitive maintenance. True intellectual and moral resistance is neutralized by offering these false alternatives, ensuring the individual never finds a genuine functional axis for their personality. Escaping this cycle requires an act of individual recognition. Intellectual independence begins by identifying this binary trap. We must see both the exalted rebel and the banal realist as outcomes of the same physiological pressure. Maintaining a genuine ideal is not a sign of naivete. It is the only way to retain the structural integrity required to resist external molding. Holding to this internal axis is a specific act of psychological self-defense. It preserves the higher functions of the mind, altruism, truth, and justice, against the dissolution into primitive biological fear. Human intelligence retains the capacity for objectivity and refusal, even under extreme stress. This capacity is what allows a person to stand outside the environmental conditioning that produces cynicism. The system can apply pressure and use the language of threat, but its influence is limited by individual consent. As the source material summarizes, "It can bark, but it cannot bite, unless I desire it."